Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pavel Pyś. I'm a curator in the Visual Arts Department and lead curator of Multiple Realities. Welcome to The Walker. Before we begin, I'd like to ground us by acknowledging that the Walker Art Center and the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden are located on the contemporary, traditional, and ancestral homelands of the Dakota people. This site, which was once an expanse of marshland and meadow, holds meaning for the Dakota, Ojibwe, and indigenous people from other Native nations who still live in the community today. It is my great pleasure to acknowledge the many generous supporters of the exhibition. Lead funding was provided by Martha and Bruce Atwater. Additional support was provided by Carlo Broncini-Vender, Jim Kahn and Jeremiah Kolatz, Martha Gabbert, Karen and Ken Heitoff, John Thompson, the Weiser Family Foundation, as well as Anonymous. The exhibition's catalog was supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and exhibition research was supported by a curatorial fellowship from the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. I also want to thank our media partner, Minneapolis St. Paul Magazine, and acknowledge the Walker's technology partner, Atomic Data, and the voters of Minnesota who support the Walker through a Minnesota State Arts Board operating support grant, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. To mark the opening of Multiple Realities Experimental Art in the Eastern Bloc 1960s to 1980s, I very much wanted to foreground the voices of contemporary artists from the region, inviting them to reflect on how the region and the time that the exhibition looks at have impacted their practices. And this afternoon, I'm really thrilled to welcome Slovenian filmmaker Jasmina Cibic and Polish artist, performer, and choreographer Ania Nowak. London-based artist and filmmaker Jasmina Cibic represented Slovenia at the 55th Venice Biennial. Her solo exhibitions include, among others, Mac Lyon, the Museum of Modern Art in Salzburg, Muzeum Sztuki Łódź, MSUM Ljubljana, CCA Glasgow, MSU Zagreb, the Ludwig Museum in Budapest. In 2021, she was awarded the Film London Jarman Award, and in 2020, she received the B3 Biennial of the Moving Image Award. Ania Nowak approaches vulnerability and desire as ways towards reimagining what bodies and language can and cannot do. Novak develops formats such as live and video performance, installation, and text. In their practice, they engage with bodies in their nonlinear feeling and thinking capacity to tackle the difficulties of companionship and care in times of perpetual crisis. Ania collaborates with alternative educational programs in Eastern Europe, including the Chem School in Warsaw and the School of Kindness in Sofia. She recently had an incredible exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw that she will talk about a little bit today. And their work has also been presented at the KW in Berlin, the Museum of Contemporary Art Kiasma in Helsinki, and the 12th Gothenburg Biennial, among other places. So today, we will each I invited Jasmina and Ania to offer a reflection and a little bit of an introduction to their work, but also to really think about how this period that none of us lived through, but how the shadow of this long period impacted their practices. So it's only fair that I should reciprocate and also think about that as someone who spent some time in Poland in the 1990s. And so I'm not going to offer the typical kind of curatorial statement that talks about exhibition structures, content, the shows on view, and there's plenty of content to chew through. But instead, I'm going to reflect a little bit more personally, also hopefully not being indulgent at the same time. So I want to talk a little bit about how this period and the time in some ways also impacted me. Having spent most of my childhood in Warsaw, a city that has this incredible structure in its very center, the Palace of Culture and Science. This is an unwanted gift from the Soviet Union given to the Polish people in 1955. It's an iconic building that still continues to be divisive. Some people absolutely love it. Others hate it and keep calling for its dismantling. It's not going anywhere. For some, it's a reminder of the Soviet influence. For others, it's an eccentric and strange relic that's worth keeping. And Warsaw is really a hodgepodge of architectural styles as a place where 85% of the city was destroyed by the Nazis. So you have some elegant townhouses from before the war that have been preserved, but sometimes you come across places that feel really like they don't belong there. One of those places is MDM, which is a monumental housing estate right in the middle of Warsaw's downtown. It's a master plan kind of brainchild of socialist realism. It was designed to be a home for working class families. It was actually the place where most of the Communist Party members, clerks, and other political elites had apartments. So a quite paradoxical place, and I think paradox is something that we'll talk a little bit about when we go through these slides today. Another paradoxical site is the Soviet military cemetery, which is right next to the airport. If you land in Warsaw, you'll take a taxi into the city and you'll pass it on your way. It's a place where 21,000 Soviet soldiers who died fighting Nazi soldiers are buried. It was created in 1950. Its center is marked by a tall column with a red star and with elaborate socialist realist sculptures on the sides, which are vandalized constantly, typically on the anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Poland. It's also a vast open space, and it's perfect for fashion photo shoots, which happen there all the time as well. So Roland Barthes famously wrote that photography actually blocks memory. It quickly becomes a counter-memory. And as I was preparing for this talk, I was reflecting on how I have this very vivid memory in my mind from my childhood, from being in Budapest in 1990 or 1991. And I distinctly remember that on the iconic Széchenyi chain bridge, the communist emblem was shrouded. I remember looking through the back of the car and looking through the window and seeing this incredible thing, which is insignia covered by a shroud. And then in preparation for this talk, I desperately looked all over the internet. I could not find a single image that corroborates that memory. But it stuck with me for a long time. I think I was only 4 at the time, but somehow it stayed with me. And today it has been replaced with the Hungarian coat of arms. With an exhibition like Multiple Realities, I think one of the big questions is really, how do you communicate and convey such paradoxical, heavy, but also quite funny sometimes circumstances and events? This is also a time that is very much in the present. This is a Soviet-era monument that just came down in August last year. And so while it's very much a time that's present right now, it's also a time that is it's going further away from where we are. It's a time that's gathering patina, and it's a time that people are remembering differently. A recent study showed that 44% of Poles who lived through this period remember the time positively, whereas 46% remember it negatively, which is a fascinating and very close division there. But actually, this time is gathering a patina to the extent that people are collecting things that were mass-produced. So mid-century design from this moment is very popular right now. But how you try to tell this story, which was full of hardship, but also at times very funny, and some of the images here might speak to that, which is iconic images that you have from this time of people carrying rolls of toilet paper around their necks. In the galleries, you might see one image, a beautiful color image of a couple walking down the street, connected by a roll of toilet paper, which was a common sight because toilet paper was purchased in bulk in a moment of scarcity. The images also somehow read differently given the beginning of the pandemic when we all rushed to the stores. But it's also, as I said, a time of humor, and I think that image in the top left corner speaks a little bit to that. This afternoon we'll be hosting a number of performances, which will be happening in the public spaces here. One is by Roman Ondak, and it will look exactly like this. It's a work that references the act of waiting. And so I wanted to throw this slide for you so that when you come across that piece in our public spaces, you'll see the reference that it's playing with. Ryan, can you please play the clip? Aside from paradox, I think one thing that's very exciting and strange and interesting about this time is how do you unpack meaning that doesn't readily disclose its message on the surface? What we're looking at is a film from 1972 in which we see the Hungarian artist István Haraszti, talking about a work that he made called Birdcage, which is a home for a small parakeet fitted with a swing, a feeder, an electronic monitoring system. And this film is really incredible because 1972 was already a period of a harsher reality in Hungary. And when you hear the artist talk about this work, he talks about it as a cybernetic experiment. He talks about it as a form of playing with new technology, of exploring ideas around technological advancement. But I think there's something completely else going on here in this work, because the parakeet can't escape the cage. The moment the parakeet comes close to the exit of the cage, it snaps shut. And so I love this piece because there's such a double meaning happening here. The artist describes it in terms that are legible and permissible, but actually there's a completely different meaning happening here. And so this brings me to another issue, which is how do you tell a history of art that was not written in the present? The images that we see here that are upstairs in the gallery are by the Czech photographer Jan Sagl. These are from the 1970s as well, a moment when, after the Prague Spring, a moment in which the countercultural scene was really heavily policed. And Jan and his wife Zorka were really at the center of that scene. And they understood that as their friends were suddenly facing house searches and police arrests, they could see that their lives were about to change. And Jan created this very beautiful group of photographs that just simply document the domestic bliss that they were sharing at the time, understanding that soon someone would be coming to search their apartment. And so he took these photographs, they packed up all their belongings, and then when the police came, there was barely anything in the apartment. But the story of the photographs is great because the negatives were given to a friend who put them under his floorboards. And then years later, he added a concrete floor, having forgotten about the negatives under the floorboards. And so they were presumed lost. And then in 2012, friends of the artist came to him and said, "Oh, I found these negatives in a coffee box in my library." And the images were developed and shown for the first time. And so I think another conundrum, another paradox here is, how do you tell a story of art that sometimes has a delay of 40 years? How do you also tell a story of art that might look like it is referencing quite late, let's say in the mid-1980s, referencing the language of interdisciplinary experimentation that happened in the West in the 1960s or the 1970s. But in reality, the work that you see upstairs was made by an artist who did not have any proximity to those references and to those figures. And so how do you really invite viewers and audiences to take that work on its own terms? I think there are many things about the show that, despite it, of course, being historical material, it really sparkles in the present, for better and worse. And I think here there are two works that feel incredibly relevant, particularly given aggression in the region, the war in Ukraine. We have here on the left an iconic piece that we've remade for the exhibition for the first time, Gyula Konkoli's Bleeding Monument. On the right-hand side, we have Tamás Cientyebi's Portable Trench for Three, two works that really reference the events of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, the really somber reality of having to carry wounded bodies through public space, the reality of having to care for people in a time of war and conflict. I think these are, of course, themes that feel very much relevant to where we are today. I think an inspiring part of many of the practices in the show is that they tell us a story about how to occupy space. They tell us a story of how artists were subverting behavior in public space. They tell us a story of how to gather. They also tell us a story of the risks of occupying public space. They remind us of the importance of disobedience, of standing up, of fighting for what you believe in. And I think that as you experience the works, there are visual languages here that feel as if they could have happened today. Here we have some images of a performance called Resonances from 1979. And this is another work that, as you negotiate our building today, you might experience a series of performers obstructing your way, obstructing your passage through the museum, but also a way of coming together and being together that is very much a form of protest, of occupying space. A big message that runs through this show is really a message of solidarity and of friendship and of mutual support and of being together. And when I think about what artists are doing today, young artists, that seems key to thinking about how artists are sharing space, but also reimagining their role as citizens, as institution builders. These are just two examples that really resonate, I think, given the material that we see in the galleries. On the left is Crip Fund, which is a resource, an online resource that is a fundraising resource organized by disabled and Crip artists. On the right, we have the South Central LA project by Lauren Halsey, which is called Summer Everything, a free local organic produce community center, a really important resource and an amazing art project. Another theme that I think sparkles today when we see the show is the issue of surveillance. And I love the work in the first gallery because it really, in a very analog and in a very straightforward way, it shows the mechanisms of surveillance. I'm particularly thinking of the photographs of Ion Grigorescu, but also this beautiful painting here by Matei Lazarescu. On the left is an object that I saw when I was doing one of the studio visits for this show. It's a really amazing thing that I can't believe still exists. This is essentially a piece of plastic that someone shaped and attached to a piece of wood. The wood was hollowed out. So at the very bottom here is a little perforation. This object was made by the secret police in Romania, and they attached the plastic component to a humidifier, and they would slip the wooden element under an envelope, and they would use the mist from the humidifier to open the envelope and monitor your correspondence. I love many things about this object. I love the fact that it's handmade. I think it's amazing that it still exists because so many of these materials were destroyed. But I think it's also a reminder of how this persists and continues in our lives, but we would be really hard-pressed to actually find an object like this anymore because surveillance today is, of course, much more insidious, much more invisible, much, much less noticeable. I want to close by, again, just reminding everyone of the importance of joy and of fun and of hanging out and being together. In the galleries, there are many images of that, of queer underground spaces, of musical concerts, of gatherings, of artists drinking, trying new things. And on the left is an image of Sadie Barnett's The New Eagle Creek Saloon, which is a project that references the first Black-owned gay bar in San Francisco, a project that you will soon see at the Walker. And so I think it's important to end on that note of conviviality, of friendship, and of community. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Yasmina. To Anya, sorry.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Pavel, for this beautiful introduction and for this invitation. It's a great privilege to be here and be able to reflect on my intuitive Eastern European, Central Eastern European genealogies. It is also the first time ever I am doing this. I would like to start by sharing a memory. When I was 6 years old, the actress Joanna Szczepkowska made a historical announcement on Polish national TV. With unconcealed joy and a tender smile, she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, on the 4th of June, 1989, communism ended in Poland." I don't recall seeing the TV show when it was broadcast. Surely I was too young to engage with this kind of content. I saw it many years later as a grown-up person whose coming of age coincided with the chaotic time of post-communism and the dawn of capitalism in Poland and Central Eastern Europe. I bring up this TV performance because I have been struck by its affectivity since I first saw it. Szczepkowska announces the end of communism in Poland with unabashed tenderness and hope. She's visibly moved, and I am moved with her. She really believed that a better future was possible, and I still want to believe it today. Perhaps I could estimate that for me personally, communism ended at around the time of Štopkovska's TV appearance, when I was 7 years old, and my mother started sending me to English language classes at a culture center close to where she worked in Krakow, my hometown. I don't come from a politicized home. My parents would read the newspaper and watch the news, but I wasn't raised in an atmosphere of heated conversations about politics, economy, and history. And yet, I guess my mother's understanding of the impact that the end of communist era and the beginning of the capitalist new order had on her children's lives had to do with our ability to speak, pronounce, and communicate in English, as opposed to Russian, which was the language she was taught and reluctant to learn. Karl Marx apparently said that foreign language is a weapon for the life and the struggle. He didn't say to forgive your country every once in a while. This is a quote from a Ron Padgett poem, which I used in my video and performance work Untitled 3 from a couple of years ago, in which I deal with the drag persona of Karl Marx, the godfather and father god of the communist revolution, and in which, rather than being busy with the specter of communism that is haunting or that was haunting Europe, I am busy with the bulldozer of neoliberalism, which is continuously pushing through most of the Western world. In that particular performance work, together with my co-performer, we developed a series of physical practices around the activities of carrying, feeding, and rocking. So the kind of physical activities that you engage with babies and children. And we are basically, in this piece, we are working towards a reflection on, I guess I could call it the background, the backstage of a revolution. So we are wondering about the whole labor of maintenance that needs to be done while the male revolutionaries try to push history. Sorry, is this me? Yes. Try to push the world ahead. So who does the work of cleaning? Who does the work of nurture? And finally, also who will clean up after the revolution? So it strikes me today how at some point, going back to language, in Polish recent history, well, fairly recent history, I'm referring to the 1990s, knowing English became a tool enabling choice and economic freedom. Finally, the borders opened. You could leave. You could leave in search of a better life, or a so-called better life. Towards the end of communism, knowing English became a mechanism of hope throughout all social classes. For me, it also became a strategy of escape from the grim, confusing, tumultuous reality that was surrounding me. I could be oblivious to the pains and struggles that accompany any big social change, and through my knowledge of English, peek into this whole other world, the world brought to me by cable TV, international cable TV, MTV, the world of series, TV shows, films, coming mostly from the US. And what I saw there differed enormously, as I already mentioned, from what surrounded me back in Poland. I think it must have been in the Madonna's and George Michael's videos from the early 1990s, where I first saw depictions of certain phenomena that belong to the general imagery of how progress and democracy are perceived in the West. And these phenomena are the sexual revolution of the 1960s, Stonewall riots, second wave feminism, and the AIDS epidemic. So all the phenomena that didn't have a direct equivalent, temporal equivalent in Central Eastern Europe at the time. I'm not, of course, saying that issues such as the emancipation of women or the existence of LGBTQIA people wasn't dealt with in Eastern Europe, but we were lacking an open public discourse on these matters. And of course, there is a huge imbalance between how much we know, how many oral, text, visual testimonies of those times and of the lives of minorities in those times we have from the Western world and the Eastern world. So, to be very honest, my understanding of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s is quite vague. And it feels quite challenging to admit, especially in the frame of this exhibition, that I knew of Judy Chicago before I knew of Eva Partum or of Natalia LL. I knew of Yvonne Reiner before I knew of Akademia Ruchu, the Academy of Movement. Who else is there? I knew of Karoli Schneemann before I knew of Maria Pinińska-Bereš or Teresa Tyszkiewicz. All these artists are present in this exhibition. Even though Pinińska-Bereš, for example, developed most of her practice in Krakow, which is my hometown, where I lived for over 20 years. I recently held a solo show at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, which had a very democratic and romantic even idea behind it. So next to my works, I decided to host within the exhibition some artists and works that have been an inspiration, a fascination for me. And alongside some works by artists from my or younger generations, I invited some people who I consider mentors, so my queer feminist mentors. And these people were, for example, Annie Sprinkle, A.K. Burns, who else was there? T. Corrine, Nancy Grossman. So all of the big female and dyke artists belonging to the Western context. But since I'm here to reflect on my Eastern, Central European intuitive relationships, if I want to really dig into what the queer feminist past might have taught me or how it might have indirectly influenced me, I have to think of, for example, Libuse Jarcowiakowa's raw photography of queer nightlife at the T-Bar in Prague in the 1980s. You also saw this picture a second ago in Pavel's presentation, or of Anna Dałczykowa's beautiful photography and video works, which in a very poetic and particular way depict something that I believe today we could refer to as queer erotics. And I'm juxtaposing Libuse's photography with an image from my own work called Future Tongues. It was a commission in which I was asked to imagine what theater and performing arts would be like in 100 years from now. And rather than projecting onto some futuristic, digitalized future, together with my co-performers and co-makers, we decided to focus on preservation. So we combined, it's a highly choreographed, highly staged, I would even say a museum of gestures of queer intimacies. This is a slide from Anna Dałczykowa's Kissing Hour, a work from very early 90s, which I'm juxtaposing with Golden Gate, a work of mine from 2 years ago. Dałczykowa in the, maybe I return to this. Do I know how to return to this? Yes. In this work, she's pressing her lips against the lens of a camera to engage in a kind of erotic act of self-pleasing. Oops. While in Golden Gate, together with my co-performer Frederick Gies, we are dealing with, we're working with notions of queer loss, letting go, queer mourning, queer grief, with indirect references to those times in history where queer minorities or their deaths, not only their lives, weren't acknowledged, like, for example, the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s or 1990s. And we are working here with those glass sculptures made by Lithuanian artists Pakui Hardware, working with them, engaging in a series of physical scores that have to do with mutual support, with holding each other, projecting onto a kind of a queer utopia in which queer minorities and their allies can support each other in the difficult task of letting go, of accepting. And we are working here with glass, which is a very interesting material to work with. It has a particular temperature. It has a particular weight. There's a level of risk to it. It can break anytime, so you also have to approach it with certain care, and there's a temporality and attention, mindfulness to it. Yeah. So I'm bringing all this up because when I look at those works, at my works and at Daučíkova's and Jarcoviakova's work, I have to ask myself, how did I actually overlook those queer dyke teachers? Other questions I would have is, what's love and intimacy got to do with austerity and socialism? Is personal and sexual freedom inextricably bound with one's purchase power? How to think about all all those issues outside of the binary of progress versus stagnation. I would maybe briefly quote Libuse on the times of when the photos at the T-bar were taken. She says, we knew without a shadow of a doubt that we were living in a perverse society in which the basic moral principles did not apply, and upon which the will of a foreign power was being imposed. In spite of all of this, we had hope. Quite illogically, we hoped that everything would one day change. This is again another slide from Golden Gate. So I'm bringing these works up because it strikes me that the need for representation of queer experience, queer life, queer intimacy was present already back in the day in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it persists until today. It's just I probably didn't grow up with those representations in mind. So because in the People's Republic of Poland, this wasn't something that was in the mainstream, that you could, it still is not in a way. So I feel like in a lot of what I do, I subconsciously, intuitively reinforce and express and reproduce this need of sharing my experience. Of course, for queers and other minorities, back in the day, the kind of oppression that we suffered was of a double nature. On one hand, there was the generalized oppression push of the Soviet Empire, and on the other hand, this thing that I already mentioned, which is the fact of being invisibilized, lack of a public discourse around minorities. And so, leaving Golden Gate and behind, I want to focus for a moment on these notions that I already mentioned. So the very overused currently, I feel, within the context of visual arts notion of care. On one hand, I make this critical comment, but on the other, I feel it is a very important part of what I do, what I work with, and what I try to implement when I work with people. And these aspects of certain vulnerability and resourcefulness and collaboration, I feel are very important in the works of Maria Bartushova, or Bartushova, not sure. She's she's a rather forgotten, overlooked artist from the former Czechoslovakia. She is not a part of this show, if I remember well. I imagine she hasn't been picked up for many years by Western and other curators because her work is rather abstract. And she wasn't part of this group of dissident censored artists. She, however, I find her very interesting because she strikes me as an example of social resourcefulness. She worked with plaster. I believe that in those times of scarcity, this is a material she could afford. She also worked at home while being a parent, which actually influenced her work. So she while taking care of her children, she started using kids' party balloons to cast her sculptures. And that's how she produced those bizarre, very sensual, bulging and hollow and egg-shaped and very kind of biomorphic sculptures. I find it very interesting because these works appeal very much to the sense of touch, and she herself led workshops for blind and visually impaired children in which she produced sculptures which could be arranged and rearranged, and she worked a lot with the sense of touch. And this kind of sensitivity is something that, sensitivity and sensuality, the acknowledgement of also other senses than the most dominant sense of sight in visual arts. So the haptic nature, working with plaster, with materials that are fragile, easily breakable is also something that I find interesting when working with performance. I love the combination of a sense of pleasure and a sense of discomfort that working with plaster brings. This is an image from my performance Kissing Doesn't Kill, made especially for the exhibition I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, in which as you can see, I work with a copy of a monument of a young man. And this sculpture was made to be defective. It cannot stand on it. It cannot be vertical on its own, which usually these monuments historically, their sole purpose is to stand and be erect and be vertical. With this young man, the situation was that throughout the exhibition, he was resting on the museum's floor, and he would be activated twice a week during my performance. I feel like it's important for me to emphasize this tendency that I have to work a lot with things that are out of axis, that are closer to the ground, that are horizontal, and that can be associated with notions of not doing, rest, maybe death, even. Before I go to this, the very important thing also to connect with Bartushova again, of working with this copy of a sculpture of a young man, is that with every iteration of the performance, the the sculpture would start to break a little bit, and there would be elements of plaster and rubble on the floor after every performance. So he started to disappear the moment the exhibition started. But this fascination of mine with horizontality has to do with, I think, my disbelief in the accelerated energetics of late capitalism, if I may call it like this. This is an image from a work of mine entitled Inflammations. It's a video work made in a mixed group of collaborators who identify as disabled, able-bodied, deaf, and trans. And here we worked with subjects and experiences such as chronic pain, invisible disability, and how these conditions and these experiences influence our relationship to time, pleasure, and work. And a big part of the process towards this piece was to experiment with the idea of working in crib time within within gig economy, which obviously sounds as an oxymoron, and I would never. We didn't quite succeed, I feel, but at least there was an intention of trying to think of time differently, of trying to embrace rest as part of a process. The video itself is about 40 minutes long, and 7 minutes out of those 40 minutes is representations of rest and sleep. After we recorded this scene, one of the performers, who wasn't having a great time physically at the time of the recording, stood up and said, "This is the best time at work I've ever had." So I feel it's important that we went to that direction. This is a slide from my work, a video work, Can You Die of a Broken Heart, which is a predecessor of Inflammations, in which we worked together with with Jagoda, this child performer. We worked on the intersection of languages of romantic love and of medical and languages of romantic love and languages of medical diagnosis. And we work with those processes of teaching and learning knowledges, situated and external knowledges around the body and sickness. This project basically started my whole interest in the subject of autoimmune diseases and invisible disabilities, and this whole problematic of the spectrum between sickness and health, and how they are not necessarily binary oppositions. And this brings me to one of my favorite works ever made. This is a series of photos, as you can see, by the artist Mladen Stilinović. Yes, is this correct? This work, is it part of the exhibition? No. Is entitled Artist at Work. And it is a work from the late 80s, so from the moment of transition between the two systems. The artist himself said about the work, and I quote, "Artists in the West are not lazy, and therefore are not artists, but rather producers of something. Their involvement with matters of no importance, such as production, promotion, gallery system, museum system, competition system, who is first, their preoccupation with objects, all that drives them away from laziness, from art. Just as money is paper, so is gallery a room." It's radical. I bring up this work because, well, a lot could be said. Today, thanks to the disability activists, we know that laziness is an ableist concept. And we also know that maybe there's actually something wrong with this strong binary between work and laziness, that maybe there's a third space of just time, of time off, of being in time, spending time. So these notions of idleness, not doing, stopping the activity, saying no to certain modes and models of production. I find them very interesting. It seems today that what you mentioned, Pavel, about the sort of energy and commitment that went into a lot of the artists from the a lot of the work by the artists from the Central Eastern Europe. I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I feel like this is an absolutely impossible attitude and energy today, where we are in a very different frame of and a very different motivation of production, accompanied by self-promotion and all these things that Mladen mentions. This work, of course, celebrates horizontality to an extent that I don't think I need to comment on it more. A lot of my work, as you can see, is also produced, is also made in beds, bathtubs, lying down, reclining. This, again, I'm just going to very briefly mention, is a very interesting case of how idleness and let's say how idleness and protest can be combined. This is Sanja Iveković. This is one of the photos making the documentation of Sanja Iveković's work Triangle from the year 1979, in which she is spending time on her balcony, having a drink, reading a book, and masturbating or pretending to masturbate. We don't know. While the Yugoslavian president Tito is parading downstairs. And as far as I've read, the residents of the buildings around that parade were told not to appear in the windows or at balconies. And in spite of that, Sanja decided to do quite the opposite. And I keep thinking, what are the possibilities and modes of protest nowadays and what they were back in the day? How, who has the right to protest? Who has the right to be in the public space? What about people who are bedridden? What about people who have disabilities? What about people who have PTSD? Like, how can we express our opposition, our dissent, if we are not fully able-bodied, strong capitalist, productive subjects? Do I still have a moment? Or has this been very long? Just a disclaimer, I'm very heavily jet-lagged, so I barely know what my name is. That's why I don't understand time. As I already mentioned, or as Pavel already mentioned, in what I do, I'm very busy with what bodies can and cannot do, given a wider social context that includes ableism, gender, class. And I feel like a lot of what I'm doing for myself and with my collaborators and in the artistic product is seeking options, possibilities to circumvent heteronormative turbo-capitalism and looking for relief outside the capitalism communist binary. I work a lot with intimacy, and I work a lot with touch, and I work actually also a lot with language. Language of intimacy, language of protest. How do I make this work? This is a work by Ewa Partum, a Polish artist who's actually still active, called Homage to Solidarity. Solidarity is the social movement in Poland that was instrumental in bringing communism to an end. And this work that you see is a result of a performance she made at a gallery in, I'm not sure if in Łódź or in Warsaw, in one of the big Polish cities during martial law. So basically, while being naked, she approached the word, she started putting up the letters of the word solidarność, solidarity, and then she would offer a kiss to every letter. I believe she did it because she considered the strategies of doing politics, of doing protest by solidarity, very similar to art making. And here am I. I actually learned about Homage to Solidarność very recently, just after I stopped performing this, which is also an excerpt of Kissing Doesn't Kill, in which I land a kiss between, on the left-hand side, you cannot see it, there are photos by T. Corrine, an American photographer and activist, depicting two female lovers, one of them with crutches, the other one able-bodied. And on the right, a modernist painting from the early 20th century by Wojciech Weiss called A Kiss on the Grass, which depicts a couple within a landscape of a meadow, a couple which we could question today. What kind of couple is that? Is that a heterosexual couple, or is that maybe some other? There's a chance that it's not what we think it is. And here I continue with works from that era that at some point I realized I am indirectly working with, or that are working through me, or that mean something to me. This is Natalia Ellel's work entitled A Word from 1971, in which she pronounces phonemes of a word which we don't know what that word is. So basically it's her working with the vocal apparatus, with pronunciation, with the physicality of speech, as if focusing so much on the meaning itself and on the message itself wasn't the main goal. And this is me in a work of mine called To the Aching Parts Manifesto, in which it's a heavily text-based piece in which I work a lot with repetition, reformulation, and reduction. I work with, so I mentioned the importance of growing up and learning the English language. English at some point became for me a prosthetic, a form of drag even, a tool that enabled me to have a kind of a life of two identities. So one, the identity of the transformation or the transition, the local post-communist, Eastern European, sad identity. And on the other hand, the borrowed, global, universal, dominant, energetic capitalist identity. I want to point to like a psychological, emotional element in all this. At some point in Polish history, knowing English was like, how should I say? Knowing English was part of a transition into neoliberalism, but also into a certain aspirational normativity that came with capitalism, neoliberalism. Because the end of capitalism in Poland wasn't like an amicable breakup. It was a hard-won, dramatic, highly energized event of strong affects. All of a sudden, we didn't want to be like we used to be anymore. We wanted to forget. We wanted to fit in with the larger world and be recognized as equals. And of course, not fitting in, not being taken as equal was a cause of pain. And here I want to refer to a beautiful text by Polish curator and writer Natalia Sielewicz called Feminist Cruelties. in which she mentions that the concept of shame, guilt, and other undesirable affects is present in many countries throughout Eastern Europe as a result of the mentioned transition into neoliberalism and aspirational normativity. And she continues to say, I take this observation from Natalia, she takes it from the Czech scholar Kateřina Kolářová, who observes that in the post-socialist context, the aspirational utopic promise of the good life was often expressed in the moral imperative to overcome the failure and shame of the bad past. So, as I mentioned, I think for me, English has been a prosthetic, a tool enabling me to work in the West. I am based in Germany, in Berlin, where, of course, a lot of what I work is a lot of what I do is a certain compromise with how I express myself, what I can express. And so in this work, in the To the Aching Parts Manifesto, I work a lot with accumulation and reduction. In a way, I try to express a lot with very few means. I feel this is a very direct legacy from the feminist artists' work of the Eastern Bloc, in which I put a lot of effort into creating new grammars within what there is. Artists like Eva Partum or Natalia LL, they struggled back in the day. They didn't have a language of their own. And it's a twofold situation. On one hand, we obviously the first logical association with is the censorship, but on the other hand, they also still in socialism they dealt with being in patriarchy. So a lot of those conceptual experiments with language have to do with looking for their own kind of expression, their own kind of grammar. And having said all that, I would just wrap up with this is a photo of Eva Partum's active poetry, I believe. And it's a beautiful piece from many years ago, which I think she still continues to do, or at least some years ago she did. And it's a work in which she scattered those letters made of paper back in the 80s, I think, in the public space in Warsaw, and since then, as I said, in galleries and museums. And it's a very loose, I think generous kind of work in which the audience has the allowance to pick this language up and make it their own. So I want to finish with this work because I find it a very exciting way of letting go of the control over language. And this generosity with which she does it, it's a very simple gesture, but somehow it feels very emancipating, especially when put in the context of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in communist Poland. Oh my goodness, thank you so much.
Hi, thank you, Anya. This was amazing. And Pavel, thank you for bringing us all together, for creating this really, really impressive investigation of an era of artists who really deserve to be present, deserve to be discussed, and create sort of new perturbations for us all to rethink also our practices. So I want to start with a quote that I keep on returning to ever since I've been thinking about this whole project, and that's Ilya Kabakov. And he really beautifully said, every artist compensates what is lacking. And it feels that the artists of multiple realities share a very specific lack. And I would say that's sort of a paradigm of a system that could present a critical corrective or host a critical corrective for political and social reality. And they were effectively building it via creation of personal networks and friendships, solidarity, things which are returning to us all today a lot in a lot of contexts and fields. And I do think that unfortunately we are much closer to the world of the artists of the multiple realities than we hope we would be. So rather than their world being a part of a geopolitical exotic situation, I think it's an incredibly inspiring world that can show us new methods for our own context. And all we have to do as well is to, look at not only the former Eastern Europe, but, the entirety of Europe, Brexit Britain, rewriting of cultural agendas, funding situations. So Poland, Hungary, Slovenia all went through exchanges of lots of directors in museums and theaters and concert halls recently. So things are still there, they're persistent, and I guess in my work, I really try to work through those ideas and issues with challenging the systems of control. So effectively, I create large research projects, which ultimately finalize in films, in installations, but mostly they are collaborative. And also listening to Anya, it really makes me think so much about how the practices coming from these territories have centered this collaborative nature, but not only with other artists or performers and, let's say, researchers, but also with institutions of power and authority that really do need to continuously be questioned within this sort of kind of production. So these are some images of my quite older works where I was working with the Slovene state police, with the airports. Basically, these are all works that were done when Slovenia was joining Schengen. So this idea of rewriting territories, rewriting soft power strategies, and finding ways of how do we use art and culture to create a new national or international narrative. And I just want to say as well that what I really want to point to as well is that soft power as well as statecraft, they are really great examples of illusionist tactics. And the best way how to measure the power of an illusion is through the, let's say, through the forensic lens of its failure. So dead ideologies in states can tell us a lot about their conjuring mechanisms and tricks rather than their live counterparts. So in a way, I guess what I want to as well say is that, a lot of the times dead artists are looked at as sort of these complete bodies of work, but in this case, we can also look at dead ideologies and dead nation states to learn a lot about these kind of completed sort of utopian or dystopian projects. And I just wanted to show you, I wanted to more speak about methodologies of work than comparative mechanisms. And that's really to just show this kind of continuation of investigation and debates with power structures. So this was my project for Venice Biennial when I represented Slovenia, with a project which I titled For Our Economy and Culture. And it was effectively a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total installation, that brought together sheer local specifics. So Slovenia is a very small country. We have 2 million people, so it's kind of a petri dish. And I wanted to really question this idea of whether it is still possible to represent a nation state as an artist. And we all know what Venice is, so soft power is definitely something that we can really study very well at the Biennial. And I managed to get access to the government art collection, which you can see in the central slide. So these are artworks, they are paintings that are hung behind the backs of Slovenian politicians in office in the parliament. And just kind of having this delegated performativity in a way to an art collection was what I really wanted to play with and create a debate also with the parliament itself. So they did hold a meeting to discuss whether we were taking a piss or not. So the idea really is to kind of create these as well sort of, let's say, sort of inventive performative gestures with the system of power to make them rethink their own conditioning. And so within the parliament, there is also an existent, there's only one room still that basically has not been refurbished. And in that room, I created a film where I recast an actual parliamentary debate from 1957, when the building was built, on how to choose an artist. And as history has this kind of perverse ideas of repeating itself, the uncle of the man who was against my project in 2013 was the man who was against the project in 1957. So the same names are kind of continuously there, and yeah, they don't give up. So I had two performers in Venice who were then in this kind of symbolic gesture installing the artworks. And they were installing them on a wall which was covered by a very particular pattern which I made specifically for the project. And that is a pattern which holds 1 million of Hitler bugs. So this is effectively an endemic beetle, which is found only in 5 Slovenian caves. It was discovered in 1937 and named by a Nazi sympathizer, Oskar Scheibel. And as it goes for Linné taxonomy, one cannot rename an organism except if you can prove that there has been some evolution or misclassification. So this beetle also, there's also a letter that Hitler's offices then sent to thank the namer. It also kind of maps really well this let's say quite a colonial structure also that was happening within our territories, which was where sort of Slovenian boys and girls would be the lighters of the caves, and sort of the wealthy elites would be naming these animals. So it's effectively quite a symbolic marker that now paradoxically is becoming endangered because it's collected by neo-Nazi memorabilia collectors. So this was somehow what we wanted to kind of bring together and really question, as I said, like kind of existing structures, but also work through the collections and what is being collected and how. And just to show you as well, this is the collection as it is in situ in the parliament. And the only lens in terms of selection that we used was that we chose artworks that never left their original positions. And you can imagine what these are. Yeah, works that never offend, so still lifes. And this is a collection which is, it's a very good collection. It really does host an incredible amount of the best names from Slovenian art history, obviously painters, male. And you can see on the top left side, there's Richard Jakopić, a Slovenian impressionist. That is the room of the President of the National Assembly. On the right top hand side is the room where we file referendums. And that's probably a really nice illustration of how cultural diplomacy so many times looks at art. You don't know whether the sofa fits the painting or the painting the sofa. Lower left side is the post office in the parliament, which is probably my favorite room, as it shows the painting quite high up. And when we were asking the people working there, they said, well, we were so tired of changing the photograph of the president that we just, put something there that we don't have to change. And when I speak about statecraft and scenographies and abuse and use of culture for, political national ideas, I really like to show this picture. And it's also this distinction of former Yugoslavia within this block of sort of former East is also very well presented in this exhibition. But I just do want to draw this point forward and reinstate that Yugoslavia was not a part of the Soviet bloc. In fact, it was the only European country that together with countries, together with India, Egypt, Ghana, and in Indonesia, formed the non-aligned movement. So this is a photograph from 1961 from Belgrade, where the movement was inaugurated. So effectively, it started with the Bandung Conference in 1955, and in 1961, the heads of states gathered in Belgrade and officially announced this third way of existing between the two big blocs and, sort of creating an alternative to what then formed the Cold War bipolarity. But it's this shadowing of the heads of state in the carpet that I want to talk about. So it's this idea of how do we create the scenography, the spectacle for a new ideology, for a new idea of how to run the world. And Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, was very specific in that because, of course, politicians never know what they want. They know what they don't want. And in this case, of course, they didn't want socialist realism. They didn't want abstract expressionism. So what is this aesthetic alphabet that is to come, right? And Yugoslav artists and architects were given this quite amazing tabula rasa to work with. And especially with Belgrade, what was really quite phenomenal was that, obviously this is post-Second World War world. Belgrade was extremely, basically bankrupt. But they started building this incredible urbanist plan of the entire city, and also of this building, which is the former Palace of Federation, which was the host building for this inauguration of the conference. And this was quite a feat of engineering. It was a French company that built the dome. They summoned the best artists, the best local materials, the best local wood and stone and so on. And each of the republics was given one of the ceremonial foyers to design, basically. And paradoxically, also because of that, because each of the salons was then named Bosnian Salon, Slovenian Salon, Montenegrin Salon, the building was not used anymore after the dissolution of Yugoslavia. They recently managed to rename the salons in names of color, so that apparently helps. But it's really a time capsule that kind of shows really well also this the power of the scenographic spectacle that art and architecture can create. And what I do with my work is I try to find spaces like these that have their client evacuated. And I want to look at them as theaters, as scenographic, cinematographic, and choreographic machines. And I place within them new theaters. I create films within them, and I inhabit them with other historical ready-mades, effectively. So it's I basically started using film, to be honest, because these were spaces where the public could not go. So it was very difficult to kind of gain access to parliament or situations like this. So this is where film actually started being the medium that I chose to borrow and to work with. And within this building, I filmed a third part of my trilogy Spielraum, which was looking at how do we invent a new language. This is what I was mentioning before. But this third part was effectively looking at the death of the language. So what happens when this language loses the capacity to represent? So the film is titled Tear Down and Rebuild. And it's effectively a conversation between four female figures that reinstate quotes, historical quotes on tearing down buildings and art that lost this capacity to represent. So effectively, I was using this structure really as a stage set, and I was inhabiting it with quotes from very, very different spaces to really show this universality and timelessness. And I did want to share with you this because, what is quite persistent within these spaces of power is that the female voice is still always absent. So when you go through the archives, which I work with a lot, so all the archives on nation building from the 20th century, if you do have a female, even a minister speaking, you would have a little note, a female voice from the background says. So I really wanted to bring back the agency of the activated female voice rather than, leaving it to these sculptures, which are always present within these spaces, as you can see, of not only female nude, but highly eroticized female nudes. And just a little reminder as how universal this paradox of representation is, between nation states and the female form and architecture. There's always this duality that kind of has to consolidate both the representation and the mothering and the protection and the luring, the desire-making that is effectively kind of irreconcilable. So here you have everything from, Britannia to Kosovo maidens, Finlandia, and so on. So it's actually effectively, of course, very few countries that don't have their mother nation. And yeah, these are my mother nations. So I had four actresses that were effectively representing four roles. We had a nation builder, we had an artist, we had a pragmatist and a conservationist. And what I really wanted to do with the quotes is that they actually create diverse, so one single historical person is somehow broken up into 4 different positions, because sometimes they are a nation builder, sometimes they are a pragmatist, sometimes they're a terrorist. It really does depend on the suitability of the context. And back to the whole kind of patriarchal construction of every single ideological context that we can think of. But what was more specific within the former Yugoslav moment was that for Yugoslavia, art and architecture really were chosen as this kind of like flag bearers of let's say, sort of world re-entry after the Second World War. So you have to keep in mind that and this is kind of parallel to Venice Biennale in a way, but like probably on a kind of more important scale for the world. So Universal World Expositions, which today obviously are not what they used to be, but the 1958 one in Brussels was incredibly important because it was the first, let's say, showing off power after the Second World War, where countries had a lot of time to rethink. Politicians had a lot of time to meddle, collect money, and really decide on how they would go and represent themselves to the new world of the Second World after the Second World War, right? And Yugoslavia chose really this idea of this kind of new builders, effectively new builders of this new system, which was socialism, as this re-entry into the world. And this is the model for the Yugoslav Pavilion, as it was supposed to be, by a Croatian architect, Vjenceslav Richter, who was also an artist. And Again, working with the archives, I wanted to remake this model as it was supposed to be built. So what happened was that the Yugoslav diplomacy effectively castrated the central artistic thought of Richter. So this big pillar was omitted because the politician said that we cannot go to Brussels with something that looks like a penis. And still the pavilion won the Grand Prix. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to sort of somehow like restage this kind of historical historical ready-made, but as a musical instrument. So my musician, my experimental violinist here tunes the building and plays it as the politicians were playing and tuning the architect. And just to kind of go to maybe something which is hopefully a little bit more optimistic, I was looking for a long time at commissions, at how culture is commissioned. And then I thought, well, let's look at the other side of the medal. Let's look at the gifts of culture. So I created a research project, which again has a film, has a big publication, that maps the history of political gifts of culture. So it's a film which follows 3 men as they participate in a competition that seeks a perfect gift for a divided nation via culture. So we have the 3 allegories of dance, of art, and of music that accompany these speeches, these monologues, which are all drafted from archival research on gifting. The buildings themselves, all the locations for the films, were gifts in their own right. The first one is what Pavel also showed, the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw, so Stalin's unwanted gift to Polish people, which the Polish people had to build. And then we have Niemeyer's gift to the French Communist headquarters. This is where this scene is filmed, which was supposedly a gift by Niemeyer to the French Communists. Then we have the Palace of Nations in Geneva, which was effectively built from gifts of member states of the League of Nations. I'm going to go here. So that's, the top left one. And Mount Buduzla, which is the bottom right-hand one in Bulgaria, which was the gift of citizens of Bulgaria to the communist party. And I wanted to bring together all these architectures into like a seamlessly merged edifice, which would host this fictitious competition, and most importantly, the dialogues that formed the 20th century of culture becoming this vehicle or supposed vehicle for achieving sort of a moment of solidarity and reconcilement. And this didn't work. obviously. What started as a kind of very optimistic project kind of ended up again in like sort of utter dismay of fascist ideologies that kind of came out of that, as right-wing always sort of obfuscated and took claim of all these sort of former utopian ideals. And this is a project where I kind of really wanted to kind of go to something which was really unfinished and tease it out and kind of hold these sort of unfulfilled promises of the past and kind of try to recreate a new feminist reality. And this is the archive, again, of the first conference of the cultural workers of the non-aligned, which is an archive that is held in Montenegro in the Museum of Contemporary Art. And it's an archive which was now shut for 30 years because they kind of, the museum also didn't quite know what to do with it. And I took the archive, I took the speeches of the participants, which were all various museum directors, artists, cultural diplomats, that gathered to effectively debate decolonial strategies and ideas of self-determination and moral, spiritual sort of, let's say, liberation of sort of national, local cultures. And I took the speeches and I kind of teased out effectively the sort of separate statements, which could be seen as almost like instructions of how to achieve that. So from every speech, I kind of took one central thought. And I translated the archive effectively into a musical score, which is then filmed across various architectures spaced around former Yugoslavia that were all created in the name of patriarchy to kind of entice citizens, but also international audience alike. And I worked with 8 performers, which are feeding these statements to each other across choreography, music, and spoken word. And they use these architectures really as kind of echo chambers, which kind of want to suggest a new rereading and rewriting of a kind of in a feminist way of fixing these potentialities. So I want to finish here because I think we're running out of time. But thank you so much.
So we're a little bit over time, and I want to make sure that we have a chance for you and the audience to ask any questions that you might have. But I thought I would just start with a quick first question, which I think came to my mind as I was listening to you both, and I think that's around how artists are world builders. And I'm curious if you can talk about this idea of world building as a form of challenging forms of control. And I think that there are many artists upstairs that do that. But I think that there's also that is happening in both of your work, whether it's around challenging normativity in terms of what the body can or can't do, or how the body should behave, or whether it's taking a world and reframing it. I'd like to invite you to reflect on that.
Should I start or should you start? World building. As I listened to the question, Pavel, I immediately thought of unworlding, ruin and destroying. So all these new ideas of Jack Halberstam on how we should let things go into ruin as opposed to reconstructing them and preserving them. I'm not quite sure how to answer. I feel as we can see throughout years and the pre-transition into capitalist and the post-transition years, things haven't changed that much, but the modes of being and relating have changed a lot. So I have to think. Yasmina, do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think like world building has been like recently used quite a lot as well in just remaking, restaging, fixing, and I mean, as I said at the beginning, I am very, very interested in this idea of creating something of a fiction which is so strong that it cannot be colonized, and it probably does come from the fact that practices from where we come from, have been just really labeled so many times by these geopolitical exotic mechanisms. And so I went to Goldsmiths, and my first day there was basically, you come from former East, so you will do political art in a poor material. And so there's this idea, which I think very shared with a lot of artists in your exhibition as well, is that you want to give the system its own message in a naked form, or kind of really show it the mirror and kind of speak about the processes and the other things, not just sort of like giving it the formalist image that it requires or desires.
Sure. In what I make and what I think and how I reflect, I feel the world is still a little bit behind, or the world of representation is still a little bit behind in relationship to what is actually going on. So I feel like this labor of constantly, it is a nuisance in a way, but the need for constantly building representations for things which are not yet known and understood, and imagining possibilities. I don't know, like imagining a world without capitalism, imagining a world without ableism. What would that be? Realizing that I will probably not live to see that world. So I feel it's, for me, it's about these exercises in allowing these other forms of relating. And it's very small steps, and this is not a labor of revolution, it's a labor of evolution, I find. And I think this is, it's idealistic. I feel a little bit like some hippie when I say this, but I feel this is what I'm busy with.
There was a sentence that you said, Anya, that I really loved, which was, what's love and intimacy got to do with socialism?
And scarcity.
And scarcity, and I think you talked a lot about kind of how your work resists, as you called it, hetero-turbo capitalism. And I think there are many positions upstairs that also are about that, and they're about idleness, rest, not doing as a form of doing. Could you talk a little bit both about these kind of paradoxes that you might be exploring in your work of doing but not doing, and resting but actually working? Can you talk about those dualities a little bit?
Well, I guess, in terms of what I was mentioning, this idea of this delegated execution of an artwork, which I really want to bring back to the authority, whatever that authority might be, whether it's an airport or a parliament. But this idea of, as an artist, sort of like getting a collaborator, which is somebody who would otherwise control you. So I guess it's in terms of working or like restaging. It's more like, shifting modes of direction, and who is the actual performer, and playing around with that. So I think that this is where I'm much more interested in those ideas of how can an artist actually, without this mechanism of the turbo-capitalist production, re-engage or change the way of how the work is made.
For me, I feel like it's also a little bit about this, and I don't mean to be too negative, but the hopelessness of this whole apparatus in which I choose to make work in which I can exercise living in a different way. So I create those projects to exercise not overworking, not killing myself for recognition. I don't know. I exercise working in communicating in non-violent ways. I exercise fluid, soft authority. And of course, oftentimes I fail because I don't know how to sometimes also succeed, yeah? Like I don't want to just be, but it's this whole field of the constant risk of failing. And I feel like I brought this thing of socialism and scarcity because in a lot of reflection, when I talk to my parents or about those years, there's a tendency to idealize that those were better times because people were more equal. They had similar salaries, so they didn't have to compete so much against each other. I don't know if it was like this in Yugoslavia, and this is, of course, also false, because it couldn't be like this. It couldn't be that the university professor would make the same money as my mother working for the Polish Railway in the office, you know? So I feel at the same time Poland today, for example, has the lowest level of trust within the society, within the European Union. So you wonder, did we unlearn? Did we unlearn solidarity, or was it never there? So I feel like a lot of what I do is about exercising those other modes, learning like a child in the fog. To be this other person, which I tend to think I am informed by this hetero-turbo capitalism, but in fact the people in the communism system were probably exercising similar, not all, some of them were exercising similar problematics or similar scores against this other system of oppression. So in this sense I say lots has changed, but in terms of exercising power and being influenced by power and playing with power and dealing with power, it's not so different.
There are a couple of mics here in case anyone has any questions. There's a mic on either side. There's a question in the front here.
Thank you so much, Pavel, for this exhibition. It's really going for me, really presenting new ideas in a new way. And I'd like to thank the artists for speaking about their work, and also so many interesting ideas, so many tangents to follow down. But one in particular is and something you said about fiction so strong that it could not be capitalized. Could you tell me what you think the qualities of that would be? Like how do you go about that? If it's sort of the essence of your work, what are the strategies you employ to make that fiction so strong? So.
Well, I guess thank you so much for the question. I guess I was the generation after the Yugoslav wars. I was too young to be working with that material myself, and it felt that, as the sort of the market conditions always want from spaces of otherness, they want to see the trauma. So there was a lot of artists coming from former Yugoslavia that were obviously dealing with the trauma that they experienced, and that was not my conditioning to share. I felt it was not my story to tell, and I wanted to go to the next level to really sort of question of what is the next generation messaging, or what can we do as a sort of reply to that cultural capital which was produced beforehand and which we as students were looking at. And there was a lot of artistic practices, especially in sculpture, that were regurgitating modernism, but as a purely formal revisitation. And they were not speaking about the content of why that modernism happened and what its service was and what its political engagement was. So not that that was wrong, but it was just sort of, what artists were doing at that time as well. So it was kind of, again, this kind of complete negation and the opposite of the war trauma. And I guess I was just trying to bring back out that essence and work with that essence or the intent of, let's say, of the builders or the artists, and really look at those mechanisms that are stored within the archives of, how an artist was, for example, this was quite, I don't know how it was in Poland, but like in former Yugoslavia, there would be a committee which would be deciding on how long an artist has to go and find inspiration, which is unheard of, And there were some really, really beautiful stories which I felt we lost in the transition. That we just somehow there was this unwritten contract between the state and the artists and the audiences, which we had. We had the International Graphics Biennial, which is in Slovenia, which is still going as an institution. But you would have companies that would be purchasing works, you would have audiences, and all of a sudden, all of that was quite evacuated. So I guess this was my idea of kind of going back and finding all these historical ready-mades and recreating these, this kind of fictional theaters where things kind of coexisted, but they also came from various different, let's say, case studies and territories and times to also speak of how universal this is and how quickly all of this can be repeated.
There's a question here in the front, please.
Thank you all for a lovely set of presentations and so far a lovely discussion. And One of the themes that runs kind of throughout the exhibition, that's one of my personal favorites, is the role of absurdity and humor, both as a historical fact and as a tactic that artists use toward their aims. And I'm very curious how both of you find yourself in relation both to that kind of tradition, but also whether you think that's a viable strategy today.
That's a great question. I think back in the day, and the exhibition really depicts that, artists used a lot of irony, and irony is a mode of distancing oneself. It's also a mode of survival. It's a very particular type of humor, right? And also the two works I mentioned, in which I love Yugoslavia for that. The Mladen Stilinović and Sanja Iveković, I think they're like masterpieces of this kind of approach. They're just so cheeky. I am not sure if it is... Actually, I am not sure if it is enough at this point at which we are. I don't know what would be. I have a tendency to look for humor and tenderness, or humor and erotics, erotics of humor, maybe. But every time when I engage with these kind of strategies, I feel like in what I make, actually in other people's work, I don't perceive it as such. Like, we are in such a tense moment, I feel now, historically, that humor is a great tool of a therapeutic tool, but I'm not sure it's enough. I don't know. I'm not sure it's enough for within the artistic practice to actually implement some sort of a change. It's a good therapeutic tool, though. I engage with it because of that. I don't know what you think, Yasmina.
Well, I'm a big fan of the absurd. So, and kind of working with the systems of power as I do, the absurdity is like a really, really big part of it. And, I can't hide my filming teams. So, I have to be very honest about what we're going to do. And it's those moments which are, in a way, for me, more important than the work itself. When, you are actually encountering, this sort of like the utmost authority you can think of, and you are convincing them that they allow you access, to carry out something which is basically really, really challenging their own essence. And this absurdity also then kind of comes out in the scripts of the films themselves. So for me, it is a really big part of it, and it's very, very important. But what is interesting is that it relays very differently across audiences and territories. And there's also the question of language, for example. So I do use English mostly in the films. And this was initially like a decision because a lot of the archives were originally translated mostly into English. I mean, this last film I've done, I actually do have Boston and Spanish because the archive was in those languages. But it's, I do think, it travels very differently. So that is an issue, I do think.
Well, there's one more last question in the back. That hand shot up just in time.
Maybe not if you have to go. I just thank you for the beautiful and super compelling exhibit and for your presentations. I have, I guess, two questions about transition. It feels as if, your presentations, just like the exhibit, really propose that we think about the transition out of state socialism vis-a-vis the transition we might be in right now in terms of climate catastrophe and the exit from liberal democracies. So I wondered about how, Pavel, you thought about this time period of the 60s to the 80s as opposed to any of the other potential periods. And Anya, I also wondered if you had anything you wanted to say about how we think about that collective transition and the sort of non-binary body, the transition that individuals can perform and execute themselves in our present moment. And of course, as the exhibit shows, in the past as well. So.
Thank you for that question. I think one of the guiding kind of light in terms of selection of time period and geography and material was vitality of experimentation and just the sheer adventurousness and dimensional meaning that I think can be unpacked in so many different ways in the exhibition. I think there are some things that very much speak to their time, but many other things that, as I mentioned earlier in my introduction, feel very timely today. And also the desire to shed the light on what has been a perpetual blind spot and draw attention to it and celebrate it. I think I would answer it that way. I'll pass over to you, Anya.
Could you ask me again? I'm sorry.
I think the question is about how we think about the body and its potentials for moving from within a kind of a contained body, maybe to a body of experimental openness, maybe changing across lines, across genders or possibilities, and then the society in transition. What do you think about that? Those two being.
But is this a question about the point in time of the transition, transformation between the two systems, or now?
Right, either one.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone.
It's also this word transition versus transformation is interesting because I have a tendency, we call it transformacja, we say transformation between the two systems, but actually because of how abrupt and in a way violent it was for the society, in Poland particularly, there's a tendency sometimes, I don't know if it's a tendency between like the people I know or if it's a general tendency to call it transition, even though transition is not necessarily more abrupt as far as I understand in English than transformation. I feel like there's a lot of information we don't have about that time. Within the exhibition, there's the Karol Radziszewski Queer Archive Institute, which really depicts very well the, I would say, the gay experience of the communist Poland and the cruising and the. It's very exciting, the work that Karol does. But there's a lot of we don't know, and about the other part of the queer community, which is something I'm very curious to find out from other researchers in the future. Maybe that's also something I could look into. But I'm not quite sure how to respond to this. I feel like there is something in this, this is maybe really wrong, I'm going to say it, but I'll try to say it. There's something in this Central Eastern European DNA, which is we're really recovering from, if you can recover from a DNA, because I guess you can't. There's such a tendency to cover as opposed to uncover. This is something that I feel as an Eastern European who lives in Western Europe, for example, or who is here right now, that these notions of the expansive body, which is between genders, which is between identification, which is in the sort of stretch, expanded identity. For me, this is this is really so wrong that I'm going to say it, because I wish it wasn't like this, but for me it's really a notion that belongs to the West and belongs to democracy, and it's really something. I really hate this binary of the East versus West, but I feel like my generation is really doing a lot of catching up, and is trying to understand what our local emancipatory forces were and are, whereas the people I sometimes work with as a mentor or as a facilitator, so the Gen Zs of Poland, that's like another story. These people, they're just somewhere else. And of course they're somewhere else because they were already born in this violent turbo capitalism of Eastern Europe, because it's not the same capitalism as Germany or France has, to my understanding. It's more like here, but with the local sort of dynamic. So I feel like there's a lot of secrets and there's lots of things hidden, which this exhibition also shows. But that the expansion is really like a stretched out project. And I feel like with the transformation/transition, we really had to start giving ourselves some sort of identity in this very vertiginous sort of movement. And it is, I think, only recently that there's an allowance to think of ourselves, or to think of our queerness, or of our of us not being locked into one identity. It really time had to pass. Does this answer your question, or am I speaking with something else? Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank you both so much for being here, for sharing your thoughts, and for I feel very teased because you're still seeing images of your performances now. I just want to experience them. So thank you for teasing us with those, and for being here, and thank you to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavel.